I was sitting there on the worn-out cedar porch of my family's 1920s cabin, just a man, his coffee, and his 15-year-old son, Leo, watching the mist rise off Blackwood Lake while the fishing lines bobbed lazily in the water, when the world as I knew it literally exploded. 1 second, it was just the sound of the crickets and the gentle lap of the water against the dock, and the next, a full tactical team was bursting through the tree-line, black gear shimmering in the morning light. Rifles raised, screaming commands that turned my blood to ice. I didn't even have time to set down my mug before I was being slammed face first into the hand-carved floorboards my great-grandfather laid with his own 2 hands. The acrid smell of gun oil and floor wax filling my nose as zip ties bit deep into my wrists until I felt the warm trickle of blood. Through the chaos, through the ringing in my ears and Leo's terrified sobbing as he hid under the kitchen table, I looked up and saw her standing there on the edge of our property line. Brenda Vance, the HOA president who had been the shadow over our lives for months, holding her phone up like a trophy, filming my humiliation with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. You see, Brenda didn't just want us to follow the rules. She wanted us gone, vanished, erased from the map, so she could turn our 3 acres of family history into a manicure park for her, Lakeside Restoration Project, and she decided that if fines and legal threats wooed and oppose, move me, a SWAT raid based on a fake tip about a meth lab certainly would. But what Brenda didn't realize in her rush to play judge, jury, and executioner, what she couldn't in oppose, possibly have known her little bubble of suburban power, was that her husband, Gary, didn't just work in construction. He worked for me and my firm, and I was the man who signed his paychecks every Friday. As I lay there on that floor for 3 grueling hours while they tore through our history looking for a ghost, I wasn't oppose. Just thinking about the injustice of it all. I was thinking about the long, slow game I was about to play, because when you come for a man in oppose, home, and you terrorize his child, you don an oppose, just get a lawsuit. You get a lesson in how real power works. Officer Miller, a guy I'd shared coffee with more than once, finally helped me up with a look of profound apology, handing me back my fishing license and whispering that the report claimed, active manufacturing with heavy weapons, but all they found were Leo's school books and my grandfather and Oppo's, old carpentry tools. I stood there, rubbing the deep red welts on my wrists, watching Brenda across the water on her glass balcony, her designer Yovi gear perfectly pressed at 10 a.m. as she gestured wildly in her phone, likely posting her victory for community safety, to the neighborhood group. She looked so small from that distance, so insignificant, and yet she had the power to turn my son and Oppo's sanctuary into a trauma ward in a single phone call, and that was the moment the switch flipped inside me. The moment I stopped being the nice neighbor and started being the senior project director who knew exactly how to dismantle a faulty structure from the foundation up. The Blackwood Lake cabin was everything to us, a 3-acre slice of the Oregon wilderness that my great-grandfather built with hand-carved beams after he came back from the Great War, a place where 4 generations of my family had learned to breathe, to build, and to respect the land. When my divorce went through 2 years ago, this became Leo's world, the one place where the noise of the world stopped, but the McMansion crowd that moved in during the late 80s had formed an HOA that acted more like a private militia than a neighborhood committee. Brenda Vance was the queen of that militia, a 48-year-old former corporate raider who treated property management like a scorched earth campaign, obsessed with, uniformity, and, aesthetic cohesion, over actual human lives. She started small, sending us, friendly suggestions, about our weathered siding or the, rustic, nature of our dock. But when I politely reminded her that our property predated the HOA's formation by over 60 years, her smile turned into a bayonet. What people like Brenda never do is their homework, because if she had, she would have found the, grandfather clause, buried in the 1987 bylaws, a legal iron wall that protected pre-existing structures from retroactive regulations, meaning our cabin was effectively a sovereign nation in the middle of her kingdom. But Brenda didn't oppose. Care about the law. She cared about the view, and she had spent the last 6 months escalating from fines to, safety inspections, and until she finally decided to weaponize the police. A few days after the raid, the air still smelling of the coffee that had spilled during the struggle, a thick legal envelope was taped to our front door from a law firm that sounded fancy, but operated out of a strip mall next to a laundromat. It was cease and desist, demanding the removal of our, non-compliant dock and outbuildings, or face, immediate seizure of property for public nuisance, a document about as legally binding as a napkin sketch, yet enough to make Leo jump every time a car door slammed in the driveway. He asked me, with that shaky voice that breaks a father's heart, "Dad, can she really take the cabin?" And I looked him in the eye, feeling the weight of my grandfather in Oppos, S. worry stone in my pocket, and told him, "Not as long as I'm still breathing, son, but we're not going to shout, we're going to document." I started treating my life like a high-stakes job site, installing hidden trail cams in the pines and logging every single interaction, every police visit, and every time Brenda's white SUV crawled past our gate at 2 a.m. One evening, as Leo and I were installing a new security light, we heard the unmistakable clack, clack, clack of designer heels on our wooden dock, a sound that didn't end Oppos, belong in the woods. And there she was, Brenda Vance herself, trespassing with a measuring tape in one hand and a clipboard in the other. I stepped out of the shadows, my phone already recording, and asked her what she was doing on private property at 8 p.m., and she didn't in Oppos. Didn't even flinch. She just sneered and said she was, conducting a compliance audit for the benefit of the community, When I told her she was trespassing, she had the audacity to tell me that, the lakefront belongs to the collective, and that my grandfather had essentially, stolen, the view from the newer residents. That was the night I saw the pattern, the terrifyingly accurate timing of her attacks. She always knew when Leo was visiting, she always knew when I had a late-night conference call, and she always knew when we'd be most vulnerable. I kept thinking about the name her husband had mentioned during a rare, brief chat at the mailboxes months ago. Gary, a guy who worked for, Precision Build Group, and that's when the cold realization hit me like a bucket of lake water. Precision Build Group was a subsidiary of my firm, and I had just promoted a guy named Gary Vance to site supervisor 3 months ago. I pulled up the employee portal on my laptop, my hand shaking slightly, and there it was, emergency contact, Brenda Vance, wife. The man helping his wife terrorize my family was the same man who sat in my Friday morning briefings, nodded at my safety protocols, and laughed at my jokes, all while feeding his wife the intimate details of my personal life, so she could coordinate her psychological warfare. I sat there in the dark cabin, the loons calling out across the water, staring at Gary's stellar performance reviews and realizing that the man I'd been mentoring was the leak in my own hull. I could have fired him that second. I had the grounds for conflict of interest, termination, but my great-grandfather always said that if you're going to fell a tree, you make sure you know exactly where it's going to land. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in controlled chaos. Brenda doubled down, filing a report with the county zoning board claiming we had, environmental hazards, leaking into the lake. But when the inspector arrived, a grizzled guy named Dave who had been doing this since the 70s, he looked at our pristine, hand-maintained shoreline and then looked across the water at Brenda's place. He ended up spending more time writing her up for her unpermitted glass deck and illegal, infinity fountain, than he did looking at my cabin, telling me with a wink that, some people forget that when you point a finger, 3 are pointing back at you, But Brenda was desperate now. Her, restoration project, was failing, and she was losing her grip on the board, so she did the unthinkable. She called my ex-wife. She tried to convince Leo's mother that I was, unstable, that the criminal activity, at the cabin was traumatizing our son, and that she should file for emergency custody. My ex-wife, God bless her, called me immediately, confused and angry that a stranger was trying to use our son as a pawn in a neighborhood dispute, and that was the moment I stopped being patient. I called strategic briefing, at the office on a Tuesday morning, a meeting that Gary Vance was required to attend, and I spent the first 20 minutes talking about the, Importance of loyalty and professional boundaries, end quote. While Gary sat there, sipping his coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that I was describing him. I mentioned casually that I was planning a, end quote, huge, loud 16th birthday blowout, end quote, for my son that coming Saturday, with, end quote, live music and dozens of guests, end quote, knowing full well that Gary would run home and tell Brenda, and knowing exactly how she would react. Saturday morning arrived, and instead of a massive party, I had invited my brother, a couple of close friends, and Leo's two best buddies for a quiet, respectful barbecue, but I had also invited a few other guests. I called Susan, an investigative reporter for the local, end quote, on your side, end quote, segment, who was doing a piece on HOA overreach, and I'd asked Officer Miller to keep a patrol car nearby because I, end quote, suspected a false report was imminent, end quote. At exactly 11 a.m., right as we were flipping burgers, 3 squad cars and a news van pulled into our drive, sirens silenced but lights flashing, and right behind them came Brenda Vance, marching down our path with a printed, end quote, notice of immediate eviction, end quote, and a megaphone. She was in her element, screaming about, end quote, illegal gatherings, end quote, and, end quote, public endangerment, end quote, not realizing that the, end quote, crowd, end quote, she'd reported was just 6 people sitting around a fire pit, and not realizing that the news camera was already rolling. She dragged Gary along with her, probably wanting him to see her, end quote, moment of power, end quote, but as they got closer and Gary's eyes met mine, the color drained from his face so fast, I thought he was going to pass out right there on the pine needles. He stammered, end quote, Beth? Brenda, stop, we have to go, end quote. But she was too far gone. She was pointing at me and telling the reporter that I was a, end quote, menace to the community, end quote, until I stepped forward calm as a mill pond and said, end quote, morning, Gary. I didn't in Oppos. To expect to see my site supervisor at my son and Oppos' birthday lunch. Does this count as a and Oppos? Site visit and Oppos? Or are you here to help your wife file another false police report? End quote. The silence that followed was so heavy you could hear the wind in the needles. The reporter's eyes lit up like a Christmas tree as she turned the mic toward Brenda, asking if she was aware that her, end quote, target, end quote, was actually her husband and Oppos' employer. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her clipboard trembling in her hand as she looked from me to Gary, then to the cameras, and finally to the police officers who were now asking for her ID to document yet another unfounded call. I looked at Gary, a man who had traded his professional integrity for a quiet life with a bully, and told him, end quote, we'll talk about your non-disclosure agreement and the breach of confidentiality on Monday, Gary. Bring a union rep, you're going to need one, end quote. The fallout was spectacular and swift. The news segment aired that Monday night, titled, end quote, the HOA Queen and the Boss She Couldn't in Oppos, Bully, end quote. And by Tuesday morning, the Blackwood Lake HOA board had held an emergency meeting to strip Brenda of her presidency and her membership. They discovered she'd been using association funds to pay for the, end quote, private investigators, end quote, she'd hired to follow me, and the county hit her with thousands of dollars in fines for her own unpermitted renovations that day the inspector had flagged. Gary was forced to resign. I gave him the option to leave quietly rather than face a public termination for cause, and they ended up selling their glass McMansion 3 months later, moving somewhere far away where nobody knew their names or their history. But as I sit here now, months later, watching Leo skip stones across the water where the mist still rises just like it did on that terrifying morning, I dawn at Oppos. Feel the, end quote, revenge, end quote, people always talk about. I feel a quiet, steady peace, the kind you only get when you stand up for your heritage and you realize that bullies only have the power you give them. Leo's okay now. He doesn't in Oppos. Jump at car doors anymore. And he's actually started helping me restore the old workshop, learning how to use the same tools my grandfather used to build this life. But it makes me wonder, honestly, how many people out there are living in fear of a, end quote, Brenda, end quote, because they dawn in Oppos. Have the leverage I had? How many family histories are being paved over because someone with a clipboard and a sense of entitlement decided they didn't end Oppos? Like the view. I'm curious, if you were in my shoes, if you realized the person terrorizing your child was someone who relied on you for their livelihood, Would you have ended it the way I did, or would you have just fired him on day one and moved on? Is it justice to let someone walk right into the trap they set for you? Or is that just another version of the same game they were playing? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because in a world that feels like it's getting more crowded and more regulated every day, knowing where your property line ends and your integrity begins is the only thing that really keeps you grounded. Would you have played the long game, or is life too short to deal with people like Brendan Gary? Let an oppose. Let's talk about it.